The Monsters of the Eclipse, Number 3, The Unknowing, Part 1. Lucy grabbed her bike from the rack, leapt on it, and was moving at top speed before she was even really aware of what she was doing. Miss Premiger's gonna have my neck for this one. Third cut, freshman history, summer school, third vision. Both others came true. She had to stop this one. Dad was in trouble. Had to save her dad. Lost her mom. Wasn't gonna lose him too. When she had arrived at her house and leapt off her bike, she realized her dad's car was home. There was a strange car there as well, and the front door was, unusually, wide open. The bike went flying on its own accord to the side as Lucy hit the ground already running. And as she stumbled to the open door, aghast and completely out of sorts, her world was rocked to its core.
Daddy!
But even as the word tore its way from her throat, the familiar living room before her seemed to crumble and split, splintering away from her as if her eyes themselves had shattered into shards of ancient crystal, scintillating light gleaming across the sharp edges of her sanity. Only inky blackness remained around her, in a silence so loud it threatened to shred her eardrums with 1,000 tones of silence. Vibrating more than her body, more than the void around her, pulsing, alive, through layers beyond layers of her existence. And then, all around her, sudden pinpricks of light flared into existence, great forges alight with the resurrection of reality itself, their accelerating light abruptly defining the infinite volume of space around her. As the light grew, so did the sound, and more tones laid over and over upon the foundation of deafening silence, a great screaming, buzzing, shaking howl of light being torn from the darkness. Lucy gazed dully around her, stunned beyond reaction, helpless to do anything but watch as her mind desperately tried to make sense of what was happening. She could feel the rational part of her working with frantic effort to contradict everything her senses were telling her, tiptoeing the deadly precipice of madness and despair with desperate animal instinct. The sound and light doubled, and then doubled again, every second the loudest, brightest moment of her life, and it just kept growing. With vast, impeccable inevitability, it ruptured the layers of Lucy across time and dimension, pushing, expanding, tearing her apart with a slow, terrible grace. Desperate for respite, Lucy cast her attention about her for some refuge, and the growing brightness caught her eye. She turned with growing horror, instinctively knowing without wanting to know, and found a star pulsing below her, near her, much too close. Its heat, its ever-growing heat, washed over her in great waves of destruction. Was she screaming? She felt like she was screaming, but from where? With what? Reflexively, she turned away, still feeling the great envelope of its radiation reaching out to embrace her, the unbearable howl of rage and love pulling her into the great nothing, something that twisted the very fabric of the reality around her. Then, against the great black void that was void no longer, something somehow even darker moved and saw her. Lucy's eyes widened, recoiling in a futile reflex of self-preservation, hung like a sacrifice between the destruction of light and the obliteration of dark. The terrifying non-shape looked at her. My God, how can it look at her? Lucy thought, in the frantic stream of consciousness that must precede the finality of mortal being. But it was looking at her, and more, gazing into her, casting its vast and unknowable attention on her. deep animal fear suddenly gripped what was left of the puny mammal that she had been. The madness she had held at bay at once howling through her defenses, rending her mind with the sheer lizard brain terror passed down through millennia as a final defense against the ultimate destruction of the self. And in her final moments of being, the great and terrible darkness spoke, a sound beyond sound, the energy of its intent folding the layers of her existence back upon themselves. In infinite petals and loops of space and time, a single word. The word hit her like a cosmic hammer, sending her flying back violently through the burgeoning cosmos, tumbling, spinning, screaming through the vast constructs of the universe until a bright dot began to grow in her vision, a blue-green orb resolving with terrifying speed as Lucy fell 1,000 miles an hour through the atmosphere, crashing, flaming to Earth like a great iron meteorite from the beginning of time itself. Until... crash! Lucy's whole body jerked violently awake, sending her book and pencil flying, much to the amusement of the other students around her. Dazed, their derisive laughter cut through the fog of her consciousness as she slowly regained her bearings. Math class. It appeared to be math class. She could tell because her ostensible teacher, Coach Sandals, was standing up at a whiteboard covered in a series of X's and O's that were probably football plays of some sort. But instead of his usual routine of spending all class drawing diagram after diagram while excitedly mumbling to himself about blocking responsibilities, he was staring at her with his standard blend of bored, puzzled disapproval.
Decided to join us after all. Will it matter? Hello? Jeez, what do I even...
The bell rang, covering the steady stream of recrimination they all knew by heart, the clatter of desks and chairs giving rhythm to the bustle of students headed for the next class. Lucy flowed along with the others, still feeling not quite wholly there. So it was a stupid dream. Again. That would make sense. A dream. An extremely vivid and unsettling dream. Except Lucy didn't dream. Never had. As far as she remembered. She only knew of their existence through books and movies and the steady, insipid recountings of her classmates' nightly adventures. She'd been pretty upset, honestly, at various times of her life. It really seemed like she was missing out on something, some magical time that everyone else got to do whatever they wanted. But now, these visions. She had no reference, but they seemed like something dreams might be. But then again, these dreams came true. Horribly, irrevocably true. If her visions were a representative sample, perhaps her lack of dreams was a blessing after all. But now she thought that maybe she had been dreaming all along, and that her memory was protecting her from knowing more than it believed was strictly healthy for her. She could feel it, now. This awareness that had hung about her like a cloud for her entire life, this sort of fuzzy edge of forgotten premonition, a vague sense of déjà vu that left her living a life that felt like it had already happened. The bell rang again, and Lucy shook herself back to reality. She hurried on to her next class, trying desperately to calm her mind, and failing miserably. Part 2. In the cold, sharp relief of moonlight, a vast and ancient forest flashed by beneath them. But its arboreal beauty escaped the attention of Vitale, who was, at the moment, utterly focused on just keeping up. He couldn't remember a time he'd flown this far, this fast. There just wasn't any need dealing with humans. They were slow, weak, No challenge, really. He hadn't been seriously pressed for over a millennia, which now he realized had perhaps lulled him into the slow creeping morass of comfortable living. But Gap, gods! Luckily, Vitale's vision was still supernaturally sharp, so he could make out the small dark form far in front of him. It flew without seeming effort, upright, with calm, undeniable certainty, a perfectly straight line toward their destination, whatever that may be. Vitale, on the contrary, raced and swooped, pushed his absolute limit, straining against the wind and gravity and even the bugs. Hell, why all the bugs? Hitting a swarm of lightning bugs at these speeds, while not exactly dangerous, was still uniquely unpleasant. And he still had no idea where they were going, or even where they were. What country it was that shot past beneath them was all but unknowable. Had he even considered sparing any of his energy for the effort of conjecture? He only knew that Unknowing Gap flew ahead, and that he followed. It rankled him still, this following. He was, until quite recently, absolutely sure he would never have the need to follow anyone ever again. But the Gap, it wasn't orders exactly, or even compulsion, just Gap went, and he followed. It felt like his choice, but he also perceived an almost completely hidden stirring of something deep within himself, akin to fear at the idea of examining that feeling too closely. Vitale had spent 1,000 years without challenge, only to find himself trailing a bigger dog like some kind of pathetic whelp. It was embarrassing. He should turn around now and head back to his comfortable home, his undeniable position at the top of his local food chain. If he wanted to go, no one could stop him, not even Gap. He told himself. Such were his thoughts as he flew on, chasing the dark form far ahead that led him into the darkness. Part 3. Vitale nearly overshot the dark ruins below before he realized Unknowing Gap had stopped. He floated down to earth, grateful for the chance to catch his breath. Even he had his limits, which he was becoming more and more aware of, much to his own grim consternation. Gap stood silently next to a looming crumble of ruins, the repose of some long-forgotten king, or perhaps the final resting place of a banished and reviled rebel prince, ensconced in the profane and untellable pursuits of the morally unfettered. The word echoed through Vitale in that horrible way he was still trying to get used to.
Stop pushing into my mind like that.
Vitale snapped, his fatigue and frustration goading him into a sudden daring rush of aggression.
I'll not be ordered around like some animal, some slave. What are we even doing here in this godforsaken place?
Gap's tall figure stood absolutely still and regarded him coolly. Vitale's attempt to hold his gaze was a valiant but short-lived effort. Still, Gap stood silently. The quiet stretched out between them, Vitale's quick, stinging rage slowly cooling to cold indignation, to embarrassment, and ultimately to nothing. They stood in the sounds of the vast and gloomy forest until Vitale was simply waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, Unknowing Gap nodded.
I am sorry.
His voice, while not exactly human, had less of the blinding, intruding push that scrambled Vitale's thinking so badly.
At times, I forget the fragility of real things.
Vitale looked at his feet, somehow chastened by this response after so much time, but he was undoubtedly grateful for the change. The inescapable vulnerability threatened to stir the vague, long-buried skeletons of fear and rage that tugged so distantly on his every moment, and that was a door even he feared to open.
My presence in your reality holds a cost beyond what is known to your kind, imposing limits on one even such as myself by its very nature, by the very nature of the reality that governs all things, everywhere and nowhere. This place abhors my being, constantly, inexorably working to reject my existence, to cauterize the wound, excise the cancer it perceives in me.
Vitale had never heard the Gap speak this much at one time. He felt things were being revealed to parts of him that couldn't yet understand, puzzle boxes inside puzzle boxes. But he also knew that if he wanted the slightest inkling of what he was a part of, he'd better shut up and pay attention. And so he stayed still, barely breathing, as if afraid the slightest movement would interrupt this moment, and silently willed the ancient being to continue.
It may help you to understand by thinking of my intrusion here as something like a diving bell or a prison, with the single sharpest point of a dagger stabbed deep into the unwilling flesh of the world. This is a dimension of limits, and limits are not something I am accustomed to. Your place for now is a bridge, a proxy, a tool, and perhaps more, as your destiny surely exceeds that of a hammer or a sword.
The Gap turned his full attention on Vitale, who barely stopped himself from taking an involuntary step backwards in the face of this vast, casual intensity.
Or it does not. Seek not to understand. Simply be what you are. What is possible will be revealed through the action of being, should it be willed so.
With that, the Gununga Gap turned and strode into the dim ruins, his bulky form slipping easily across the rubbled terrain. As Vitale watched, the darkness seemed to expand, enveloping his imposing shape with an embrace that invoked the essence of homecoming. Inside, Gap led them swiftly through the ruined and tumbled walls until finally he stopped in a remote, darkened corner where heavy cascades of creeping vines dug their way relentlessly into the ancient stones, pulsing with the primordial green life that pervaded the space around them. Gap bent and effortlessly dug his fingers into a slab of stone the size of a Volkswagen, heaving it from the dirt and moss with a wet, tearing sound hauntingly reminiscent of the feeding pens of the great mythical hunting beasts of Aru, revealing a worn stone staircase descending into dank blackness. A warm, damp wind exhaled from the gaping maw, carrying the rich, wet smells of loam and decay and of green, ever-expanding life. Vitale flinched as the words battered his senses, but said nothing. Baby steps, he thought, as he followed Gap down the slick and crumbling stairs. The darkness quickly melted away into the sharply defined night vision Vitale had possessed ever since he had been changed into this, whatever he was, so long ago. At least, he assumed it was something like that. So much time had passed and he had grown back from so little so many times. He had no recall of his exact origins. He remembered waking up one day long ago, his first day of being the thing that he was, nothing before that, and living, surviving, in bits and snatches for millennia, always surviving, always empty. At some point, people called him monster, vampire, fiend, striga, vrykolakas. But those were just words to him, no more explaining his existence than a drop of rain tracing across a bended leaf. Down they climbed, circling down into the dank earth. For hours it seemed they walked. Why they didn't fly, Vitale didn't know. But Gap seemed content to take his time, and Vitale didn't question him. He was in no hurry to reach this destination either, whatever it was, and occupied himself with fantasies of turning around, stalking back up the stairs, and heading home. Ahead of him in the darkness, the Gununga Gap continued on, and Vitale followed. Finally, they emerged from the twisted, crumbling staircase into a vast cavern, dimly lit by some unknown light that filtered down from the unseen ceiling above. The cavernous space stretched into the distant gloom until hidden from even Vitale's supernatural sight, a seemingly impossibly large space that dwarfed body and mind. They continued into the cavern, across a stone floor roughly hewn from ancient stone, littered with more creeping vines. As they walked, the carvings slowly became more complex until the walls themselves revealed themselves to be carved into squat huts, stained with the smoke of long-dead fires, some splashed with the distinctive ruddy hue of ancient blood. As they strode further through the twilight, the white flash of bones could be occasionally seen amongst the thick vines, gradually increasing in number and frequency until great piles of bones littered the floor all around them. The vast detritus of 1,000,000 long extinct creatures only rumored to exist, too horrible to conceive. Still, they trekked on. Vitale felt the distant creepings of a feeling so long dormant it may have well ceased to exist, sacrificed upon the altar of the thing he had forged himself into, but now phoenix-like awakened the tiniest flame of uncertainty of just what the hell was going on. Ahead of him, the broad, dark figure of the Gununga Cap strode on implacably through the gloom with single, silent focus, the shadows swirling around him. Vitale didn't much feel like talking himself, and so to pass the time he spent his attention peering around him at the increasingly strange and disturbing surroundings. Once they passed what appeared to be huge, deep, well-like holes just to the side of their path, many feet across, and full to the brim with tangled bones of long dead, what? Animals? Humans? Monsters? Was there a difference? A lurid rust-colored stain splashed across the lip of one bone well, and Vitale could only imagine what kind of foul occurrence had led to its creation. And everywhere the bones, ever more huge and fantastical the deeper they went, misshapen and shattered, evidence of great and terrible upheavals, hunts, battles, and everywhere layered and intertwined by vulgar displays of verdant, creeping plant life and slick, putrefying decay. Vitale shook himself. What was he doing? He was Vitale, the Dread, the night come alive, scourge of life itself, the fear of 1,000 generations made manifest. How many sad human lives had he snuffed out without a thought other than for his own endless hunger? Bones? He had created piles of bones in his lifetime, great hillocks that matched the highest of these damned mountains around them. And yet, even as he raged indignant within, the cold, creeping uncertainty would not listen. It played around the edges of his consciousness like a headache, warping his balance in subtle directions not currently evident, but lying in wait around some dark corner of happenstance. And still, they walked on. Part 4. Lucy thought of herself as a good person. Really. I mean, she wasn't out saving the world or anything, but she generally gave people the benefit of the doubt and tried to treat everyone as fairly and openly as possible. That this approach also resulted in her pretty much quietly ignoring everyone was just a happy side effect, she figured. Really. But she also had a strong sense of justice. So when she walked into the cafeteria for lunch and saw Abigail and her crew of suck-ups tormenting some small, sad-looking girl that Lucy didn't even know, that desire for simple rightness sent a flame of rage shooting up her spine in an instant. In retrospect, Lucy could see that this might have had something to do with it. If she'd taken a moment to breathe, everything would have probably resolved itself on its own. Things had a way of doing that, when you didn't go sticking your nose into them. But in that moment, when the hot whip of rage and indignation laid its bloody furrows across her psyche, she had no thoughts other than pure animal justice. The razor focus of her intent exploded outward, the sharp point cutting through the ether of humanity, arrow focused on the sneering bully across the room. As time slowed around her, some part of Lucy was surely wondering at what was happening. But this tiny voice, should it have existed at all, was drowned in a thundering tide of righteousness and power. The cafeteria had become a diaphanous mesh of multicolored auras, the hazy outlines of her schoolmates seemingly nothing more than the merest smoke. Anger, fear, love, happiness. Humanity's emotions pulsed around them in a tapestry of translucent chromatism. From across the room, Lucy's attention focused on Abigail, the weird, sick color of self-loathing painting her like a neon sign. And as Lucy looked within the bigger girl's hazy form, she could make out smaller orbs of light, some bursting into existence and fading, some orbiting endlessly, bobbing and weaving around each other. Instinctively, her righteous attention focused on a single orb, and Lucy somehow knew, that this small light represented Abigail's greatest fear. Lucy didn't know what it was specifically. It's possible Abigail herself wasn't aware of it, but Lucy did know in that moment that it didn't really matter. Without thinking, without considering how or what she was doing, Lucy's mind reached out and touched that tiny bright shard of fear, just touched it, really, with her attention, sending it flaring brightly, instantly, a tiny supernova flash, 1,000-fold expansion in the barest blink of an eye, subliminal, here and gone in a single frame of deepest, abject terror. The unexpected intensity of the light shocked Lucy out of her trance, time and sound crashing into her as reality snapped back and everything was normal again. Normal for most of them, anyway. Lucy wasn't quite sure what she expected would happen. Honestly, she hadn't thought much at all when the rage hit her. And really, she half expected that it was all some kind of hallucination. Another one of her dumb visions. But neither Abigail or Lucy were so lucky. The bully had frozen, silent, her eyes huge and round. She took a step back, and another, and blood began to drip from her nose. In that strange way that awareness ripples through a crowd of people slowly at first, and then all at once, the entire cafeteria fell silent as Abigail began to keen disturbingly, louder and louder, an eerie, pathetic, whimpering scream that grew and grew, spreading through the huge room even as teachers finally rushed forward to see what was wrong, even as the big girl fell and curled into a wailing ball of spasming catatonia. And all at once, the emotions that had torn through Lucy and fueled her righteous anger drained away. She felt sick and weak and ashamed, but also satisfied somehow. She wasn't sure if this was justice, but she knew Abigail wouldn't mess with anyone for a long time, maybe ever. and maybe that was okay. But the sound the girl had made, the haunted look in her eyes as she crumbled to the floor, Lucy wasn't going to forget those for a long time. Maybe ever. Part 5. Ginunga Gap strode through the dusky, silent ruins of long-ago ages, and Vitale followed. The cavernous space stretched on, seemingly infinite, the tangle of life and death giving weird new dimensions to the liminal conjunctions of natural and unnatural. Until finally they approached a clearing, hemmed in closely by the heavy hanging branches and dangling vines of ancient gnarled trees, their roots dug grotesquely into the crumbling decay beneath their feet. An unsettling fairy light glowed coldly from within the dense ring of trees. The Ginunga Gap stopped just outside the clearing, waited until Vitale had caught up to stand beside him, then spoke without looking at the younger man.
The being that resides here holds great power in this reality. I require its counsel. On the quest before us, the path of mending a reality corrupted so long ago.
Gap spoke evenly, but Vitale felt a hidden current beneath it, the slightest wavelength of, surely not fear, but uncertainty? Ambivalence? What could possibly cause this thing before him to feel anything at all?
Be still. Listen. Observe. We seek knowledge, not permission. But still, there are forms to obey. Come.
Without hesitating, he strode forward into the clearing. This place had been cleared of bones and indeed represented a transition between death and life for their surroundings. Within this strange circle green, tangled growing plant life had run amok, leaving the air heavy with humidity and the faint rustling sounds, slithering, skittering, unseen creatures of the forest. In the center of the subterranean forest expanse, shrouded in a gloom that seemed to shift with strange and uncomfortable currents, loomed a grim and gaunt creature upon a throne of sticks and bones and darkness. Its head was something like a stag's skull of terrifying scale, perched high atop a slender body, seemingly cobbled together of sticks and vines and aged, stretched sinews, perhaps harvested from other lesser beings. The massive head was mottled with lichen in fat, pretentious patterns that sprawled across the dusty, textured ivory of ancient bone. Above this ghastly vision grew a massive crown of twisting antlers, stretching out to disappear into the gloom of the forest canopy, tangled with the vines and branches that formed this wooded fortress. The Gap stepped into the clearing to stand before the great creature.
I am the living Ginunga Gap, the void made manifest, the holder of flame without flame, beyond this and all worlds. I seek audience with you, forest god.
All semblance of restraint was gone from his speech, and even from the edge of the clearing, Vitale could feel them batter his psyche. But in this space, the massive voice of Ginunga Gap seemed almost calm and measured, not blunted by the surroundings, but somehow in scale with them. The strange underground forest around them fell silent as he spoke. The great empty head of the forest god turned slowly to cast the shadowed pits of its eyes onto the small, dark shape that had invaded his kingdom. Minutes ticked by as the two figures regarded each other. Finally, the thing spoke.
I know the void. I was here when you receded before this world. And I shall be here when you return, opposing through conflict what cannot be. This is not your time, Gnonga Gap.
The thing's voice, belying its towering stature, was thin and layered, the sound of branches rubbing in the wind, of plains of grass dancing before a summer storm, of grotesque, chitinous insects skittering across the dry leaves of fall.
I have come to heal the world, God of life and decay. The unnatural one's power has grown untenable, intruding even into the meta realms that border this place.
The Gap replied.
Surely you feel this influence and sense its danger.
The looming figure leaned forward on its towering throne. It breathed.
I know both the threat and its source, Void. Perhaps your presence will only worsen our fates once again.
The gaunt god leaned back, gesturing dismissively with one bony hand.
What is a leaf to the wind? All will happen. All must happen. Until darkness returns to claim all justice for itself. But you are not that darkness.
Vitale could sense a careful balance being played out before him, but its deeper meaning escaped him. Again, he felt the uncommon trickle of what he refused to believe was fear, an anxious crawling at the base of his skull that hinted at the great consequences hiding just beneath the surface. He stepped closer, almost involuntarily, drawn toward the power at hand like a moth to a flame.
In this manifestation of life, the unnatural things by their nature corrupt the weave of this world. You cannot avoid this corruption.
Gap's words rolled forth with calm, inexorable reason.
For you are enmeshed in that weave. Only I can perceive the true danger, for I am not bound to you or any other. Only I stand apart, and therefore only I can comprehend this threat.
The forest god scoffed, tossing its mane of thorns and shaking its terrible bony head.
Tainted. I am poison and cure, the seeking and the finding. You know the genesis of this plague. How is it you cannot know its cure?
Gap stood like a dark stone, contemplating the figure that loomed before him in a silence that stretched on such that Vitale lost all track of how long they'd all been locked in place. The forest sounds slowly returned around them as the creeping things forgot their caution in the stillness. Finally, the Gap spoke, his rumbling, crashing voice dropping a hammer of primordial fear on the hidden forest creatures nearby.
I have come to manifest this cure, but immersing myself in the river of time has blinded me to many things known and unknown, and in this quest, I require your counsel.
The wild god slumped petulantly on its throne, casting its skeletal visage about in a seeming fit of pique until its hollow gaze fell onto Vitale, who hovered at the edge of the clearing.
What is this, little void? The sacrifice to tip the scales. The first child to die in service to a god you do not serve. Such a tiny morsel. Best fell the knife now, Void. A penance long overdue and cowardly to postpone.
Vitale felt the hot sting of these words strike him like a whip, and red rage uncoiled within him in an instant. He was moving forward before he was even aware of it, scorn rising from his belly and spilling out his mouth like a torrent.
Sacrifice? Try me, little god. We'll see who takes their pound of flesh. deal with the business before you and mind your tongue.
The forest god regarded the enraged Vitale, whose wide river of anger still fed his defiance, even under the crushing weight of the god's empty gaze.
Nature is hunger. You think yourself worthy, sacrifice? Prove yourself worthy.
The three figures stood rooted in absolute silence, the tensioned energy of uncertainty growing every moment like the premonition of a lightning strike. Then came the distant, crashing sound of something big, rapidly approaching through the strange forest that surrounded them, growing louder and louder as the unseen interloper drew closer and closer, tearing its way through the dense primordial forest. Suddenly, behind the massive throne appeared a nightmarish creature that served context to the mountains of bizarre skeletons that had lined their path. The progenitors and prey of great aberrant brutes from the forgotten ages of chaos. It burst roaring into the clearing, casting its great head side to side in unholy rage. Its shape was something like a great ape, but far larger and more viciously developed, with razor-sharp claws and patchy, matted fur. It was covered with sharp, chitinous plates, with a long, bony head and gaping maw that framed wicked, slavering fangs. It screamed a challenge, its sinuous, spiked tail lashing violently. Vitale absorbed this for a moment, before turning to Unknowing, who gazed back impassively.
Seriously?
The response came like an avalanche.
Prove yourself!
Before Vitale could respond, the creature was upon him. Its first vicious blow sent him flying from the clearing, crashing and tumbling back along the path they had entered by, smashing deep into the pile of weird bones and debris that lined the cavernous space. Vitale was vaguely amused he was still conscious. He couldn't remember having been hit that hard by anything in his millennia of existence, and briefly wondered if he was hurt. Briefly, because in the blink of an eye the creature was on him again, raking him with its claws and snapping its needle-sharp teeth at his neck.
How can anything this big be so fast?
Vitale's thoughts raced and jittered as he was again flung away violently. Slamming hard against a massive boulder, he crumbled to his knees, bleeding from a dozen wounds. The pain and shock of his injuries washed over him. His long life of power had made him woefully unprepared for agony like this. In the distance, the creature screamed another challenge, its razor claws striking sparks from the ancient stones. It charged again. Vitale dropped his head and breathed deeply, time slowing around him. He knew this was a moment of true peril, perhaps the first one he had ever faced. He could feel his death coming for him, loud and hot and sharp, felt the burning, impotent rage that couldn't help him. And even as he breathed in the last moments before his death, if death truly meant anything to one such as him, he could feel the distant presence of Unknowing. The void made flesh, the gravitational pull of his proximity tugging faintly at the edges of his consciousness. And then, beneath the anger, beneath even the fear that Vitale couldn't face, wouldn't even admit existed, he found a calm trickle of pure, absolute certainty. His fate was his alone. He might die that day at the claws of this hideous monstrosity, but he would not go so easily. He was Vitale, the dread, the unending, and he would not fall easily. As the terrible creature bore down upon him, Vitale reached deep into the great black well of nothingness at his core, into the vast ocean of power and peril that had sustained him for longer than human memory. It surged up through him, finally unfettered, raging and roaring in great, awful waves that burned pleasure and pain through his body like a river of electric magma. Yes. The creature arrived with a blood-curdling roar, slashing its vicious claws with enough force to cut Vitale in half. But Vitale was no longer there. He darted to the side, blurring through the air faster than the eye could see, striking at the creature's flesh with his own razor-sharp claws, long unused, now extended like wicked daggers from his long, graceful fingers. The creature turned like a flash, but again, Vitale blurred away, raking at the creature's arms, desperate to pierce tendons, blood vessels, anything that could damage this unnatural monster. The creature roared as the smaller figure danced away, dodging, striking, pushing himself in ways he hadn't thought possible. It felt good, amazingly good, to push and find no bottom, just pure flowing power, almost intoxicating into freedom. Which is why he never saw the creature's tail, twisting, weaving, and finally snapping forward in a lightning strike, impaling his chest and spraying bright red blood across the white bones around them. Vitale roared as the demon creature jerked him into the air, letting him dangle from the cruel barbs before bellowing its own cry of victory. With a snort, the hideous beast twitched its great body and launched Vitale into a shattered tangle of bizarre skeletons locked in an eternal struggle of attrition, the razor-sharp edges slashing his leathery skin, piercing his impenetrable hide. He lay there in a daze, his body screaming at him from every quadrant. There was a rattling in his chest. When he breathed, that sounded like something had come loose, and he could feel his broken ribs scraping against each other. He tried to wipe the blood from his eyes, but his arm wasn't working properly. No part of his body wanted to work properly. What he could only guess was the beginning of shock washed over him as his body registered what had just happened. He shook his head slowly, his thoughts slow and muddy, held up his troublesome hand, and found a massive shard of shattered bone, the razor-edged detritus of some great prehistoric beast, impaling the length of his forearm from elbow to wrist, protruding from his arm like a gory spear. He gripped the bone with his other hand to wrench it loose, but couldn't get a grip on the blood-slick surface. As he struggled, a crashing, thudding sound slowly intruded on his consciousness, and he turned to see the horrifying creature thundering toward him, its bloody, gaping mouth twisted in a rictus of rage. The dark energy exploded within him as the survival instinct of 1,000 lives took over, sending him rolling, jumping, skittering backwards, faster than sight, faster than he had ever moved, the devil-ape thing only inches behind, a gibbering, whirling storm of pure murderous violence. The monster's vicious serpentine tail darted forward at the speed of thought, but Vitale was quicker still, lashing out instinctively with the obsidian-sharp spear of bone still embedded in his forearm, his own blood streaming from the blade in graceful crimson ribbons as it arced toward the lunging beast. Through luck or skill, the razor point slashed cleanly through one of the great beast's eyes, a thick, translucent liquid streaming as it sprayed from the ruined orb. The ape creature roared in pain and clawed at its face in agony, reeling away in sudden, blinded madness.
Come on, get up, you puss.
As the monster thrashed, Vitale fell heavily to one knee, exhausted. He had only a moment to gather himself, and he was determined to make the most of it. He looked ruefully at the carnage of his ruined arm, then made a fist and grinned darkly at his gory weapon. He couldn't argue with effectiveness, and the pain was keeping him alert, at least for the time being. He glanced away, and his eye was caught by the glint of light on some peculiar shape, a great amber-colored talon as long as his arm protruding from the broken tarsal bone of some weird and terrible dragon of legendry. He bent and took up this evil-looking makeshift weapon, the smooth bone fitting his one good hand as if made for it, and turned to face his fate. The beast had recovered its senses and again stalked toward him, huffing hot breath in anticipation of the slaughter. The two creatures faced each other, tension ionizing the air between them. Vitale's whole body throbbed, his body dripping like rain on the broken floor. But still he stood, fearless, breathing, feeling that black river of power fill him, clear of mind, certain of purpose. He would prove his worth, or he would die. As one, they roared. The creature shot forward, a sheer murderous mass moving like a freight train, unholy, strong, and mad as hell, pure death and chaos and deadly intent. Vitale rose to meet it, blurring forward, then dodging its charge, slashing, stabbing, bone blades flashing, a buzzsaw of dancing, swirling violence. With a roar of unfathomable rage, the demonic animal reared back to strike its final deadly blow, and Vitale seized his opportunity. In one lightning-quick move, he leapt forward and buried the bone spear deep in the creature's chest, the beast's mighty bellow suddenly choking off to a bloody gurgle. It moved to crush Vitale in its massive arms, but he tore himself away with one final effort, the bony shard finally ripping free from his ravaged arm, still embedded in the mangy chest of the monster. The wounded creature threw itself at Vitale in a final spasm of death and pain, its massive strength augmented 100-fold by panic and desperation. Vitale reacted without thinking, rolling free of the great beast, whirling with supernatural speed to bring his grotesque taloned sword down upon the creature with all the strength left in his battered body, a great ragged cry of rage and victory tearing from deep within his very soul. With a sickening thump, the creature's head fell to the rough stone floor, the black ichor of its blood spraying a great dark stain across the scattered bone landscape, its gurgling death cry shaking the stone walls of the massive cavern before fading into unnatural stillness. Part 6. The final bell was still ringing off the rows of lockers that lined the main hallway as the deluge of teenage humanity streamed for the school exits, chattering away with the endless energy of inexperience. Lucy drifted dully along with other students in a haze, numb to the noise and activity around her. She felt detached, exhausted, and shockingly, terrifyingly alone. Her feet carried her outside through sheer force of habit, toward the curb where her dad would be waiting, without fail, in his gray, sensible car. He was always there, always on time, always at the front of the line, as if he spent all day just waiting for school to be over. She wasn't 100% certain exactly what he did for a living. She knew he worked from home, doing some boring business stuff in his boring home office. But what all that meant, she really had no idea. But in this case, it had all worked out in her favor, because she hadn't ridden her bike to school since the vision, or dream, whatever it was, had filled her with the unimaginable dread of losing her only remaining family. It had been just the two of them ever since she was 5, ever since they had lost her mom to a drunk driver on some godforsaken road somewhere far away. Lucy didn't really know anything more than that. After all, she was only a little girl when it had happened. She really only knew that one day her mother was there, and the next she wasn't. Her memories of her family then were warm, golden-colored, full of love and happiness and laughter. But that was long ago, and those memories were threadbare, eroded by the ceaseless river of time. And now, as she trudged toward the curb where her father waited, as expected in his drab car, Lucy could scarcely believe this was the same man from her long-ago memories. Ever since they lost her mom, it was as if all the color had leaked from his life, leaving him a dull, gray copy of himself. Lucy quickly felt a tiny stab of guilt at even thinking this way. She knew how hard it had been on him to lose the love of his life. She couldn't imagine the pain he felt, the fear at being left all alone with a young daughter, the impotent rage at their comfortable lives being torn away in an instant. She had felt this too, of course, but she also felt it was her responsibility, even then, to pick up the pieces of their family, to love and support her father as he grieved. But the light in him had never come back. He remained cold and dull and disengaged in their lives. He was never mean to her, and she always had what she needed growing up. Everything except a real relationship with her father. She felt more like they were strangers, roommates, perhaps vague acquaintances who would nod slightly to each other as they passed in the hall. But this was her life, and in the grand scheme of things, she couldn't complain. There were people out there with real problems, not just a dad who wasn't as interested as he should be. Everyone deals with grief in their own way. This had been drilled into her through years of therapy, and she couldn't very well judge her father for however he dealt with it, even now. Mired in her thoughts of the past, she passed by a small knot of students and the girl she had saved in the cafeteria earlier caught her eye with a brief smile and small awkward wave. Lucy felt her face get hot, and she dropped her eyes and hurried to her father's car.
Hello, Lucy. How was school?
He asked in a flat voice as she slipped into the passenger seat.
Good enough.
She replied, adhering to the standard format of the brief interactions that seemed to form the bulk of their relationship. Usually, that was the end of it. But as they pulled out into traffic, her dad continued without looking at her.
Anything unusual happen? I thought I heard some of the teachers talking about some kind of emergency.
Lucy shifted uncomfortably in her seat.
Yeah. Some girl had a seizure or something, but I don't really know her.
Thanks for listening. You know we appreciate every single one of you guys. This episode has a really great cast. We'd like to thank them all, starting with Kristof Fruru, who did an absolutely mind-blowing job with the Forest God. Thanks so much, Kristof. He has a channel of his own called Miniature Mythos, where you can hear him read all kinds of fiction stories with his powerful and unique voice. Absolutely worth checking out, so go, check him out. Next up, we have Pete from I Read Books, a wonderful, multi-talented soul who was kind enough to take on the part of Lucy's dad, who we'll be seeing a lot more of in the near future. Pete also really conjures up some great tales for us over at his YouTube channel, I Read Books, with his melodious, calming tone that is sure to relax even the most stressed of us. Totally quality entertainment over there, so check out I Read Books today. The small part of Coach Sandals was taken on by a good friend of ours, Mike Jimenez, who is the head wizard over at the Weathered Dragon, a company committed to creating the most wild and over-the-top RPG gaming tables you can imagine. They have a website and a YouTube channel, so check them out for your gaming furniture needs. And last but not least is the wild and wonderful Katie Hanish voicing Lucy. She's a visual artist who's been using her fantastic voice to dabble in singing and voiceover work since her single-digit years. Please like and subscribe so we can keep you updated on what's new and when the next Monsters of the Eclipse hits the interwebs. We'll see you next time we open up the Dusty Tome.